Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for stopping by the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art today for this afternoon's artist talk by Martha Glowacki. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the Ho-Chunk people on whose ancestral land Madison was built, as well as recognize the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Now is your reminder to silence all cell phones and electronic devices, though while you're checking the volume levels, feel free to quickly open up your favorite social media app and follow the museum at MMoCA Madison to stay in the loop about other upcoming talks and events. Today's talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Imaginary Eye, on display in the museum's main galleries through April 7th. The exhibition explores the similarities between artists, scientists, and mathematicians as they explore and seek out unknown worlds and concepts, project future and undiscovered realities, and reclaim, retrace, and reveal the patterns around us. Starry Transit, an installation by Martha Glowacki, was first held in the dome of UW-Madison's historic Washburn Observatory as a collaborative project between the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art and the Astronomy Department at UW-Madison during the construction phase of the museum's Cesar Pelli design building that we're in now. Martha Glowacki's artistic practice concerns human observation and the description of the natural world. Her sculptural work uses both found materials and constructed objects as a contemporary cabinet of curiosity. Appearing in Renaissance Europe in the 16th century, the Cabinet of Curiosities is an early ancestor of the modern museum, playing a fundamental role in the development of modern science as rooms dedicated to the selection of rare, eclectic, and esoteric objects and scientific accoutrement. However, cabinets of curiosity weren't necessarily scientific. It was not uncommon to find dried dragon blood or mythical animal skeletons next to fossilized shells, works of art, exotic plants, and other antiquities. While the popularity of Cabinet of Curiosities waned during the 19th century due to the rise of institutions that required a level of scholarship and authenticity, such as museums and university-affiliated collections, they are an important historical connection regarding the intersection of art and science and the influence of data and artistic expression, one that continues throughout the exhibition upstairs, Imaginary Eye. In addition to her sculpture and installation art, Martha Glowacki was an academic curator of the Design Gallery at UW-Madison and is the former director of the James Watrous Gallery at the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters. She has been the recipient of grants from the Wisconsin Arts Board and the National Endowment for the Arts. Her work is included in many collections, including the John Michael Kohler Art Center, the Chazen Museum, and here at the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art. Please join me in welcoming Martha Glowacki to the stage.
Hello, everybody. Oh, this is such a treat. Thank you, Bob, for that introduction. Some of the points I'm going to cover in the talk, he talked about very briefly, so that's great. As Bob mentioned, I'm talking to you today about an exhibition that I did called Starry Transit. It was done in collaboration with the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art as exhibition off-site when they were constructing this building. And the other major player was the University of Wisconsin-Madison, specifically the Department of Astronomy. The show was held in 2005, which is getting to be almost 20 years ago, in the dome of the Washburn Observatory on campus. Out of all the work I have done over a long career as an artist, this project remains my favorite of all the exhibitions that I've done so far. This afternoon, I'll talk about the development of the exhibition, the sources that I used to develop my ideas for pieces, and how the project came about. But before I start, I wish to dedicate this talk to Steve Fleischman. Without Steve's encouragement and support, Starry Transit would not have happened. So thank you, Steve. I also want to do, as they say, a shout out to 3 people who are in the audience today, this is great, who are really involved, were instrumental in the development of this show. One is Sherry Castelnuovo, who is the former interim director of the museum, but also for many years, she was the education's curator here. And she developed a slate of educational programs that became like a cult. You know, people would fill the observatory to the rafters to come to hear talks because it was such a special place. Also, Jim Lattice, who's up here in the 4th row, and some of you probably heard him last week, 2 weeks ago, talking about Washburn Observatory. So he is the director of Space Place on campus, also directs the public viewing at Washburn, and also is a friend. And I figured if there was any way I was going to be able to do this show, it was by twisting Jim's arm, which twisted pretty well. And then the third person is Robin Ryder, who is the director of, I'm not sure exactly your title, of Special Collections at the University of Wisconsin's Memorial Library, and also a friend. I have spent a great deal of time in the collections, particularly for this exhibition. Many of the things that I looked at were from books and special collections. So thank you, Robin. Looking back, I realize what a leap of faith this exhibition was for me. I'd never done a site-specific exhibition, and this was not a particularly easy site to do an exhibition in, the Washburn Observatory Dome. But I figured I can probably do this. I want to do this, so let's give it a try. Also, this was a really complex collaboration. I like doing collaborations, but this one was over the top. It was between 3 institutions and lots of people. For one thing, it required a 90-page contract between the University of Wisconsin and MMoCA. And they got it together, and it all worked. When I wrote an initial proposal to the Department of Astronomy for this show, I said, and I think this is a good summary for what I tried to do with this show, my intent with this exhibition is to encourage viewers to think about how scientists work, to reflect on the value of different ways of observing natural phenomena, to celebrate the special history of the Washburn site, and above all, to create some sense of the beauty and magic of the natural world. So I'm going to start out by showing you some inspirations that came together to create the idea for the exhibition. First of all is the Washburn Observatory. And again, those of you who are familiar with campus or who came to Jim's Lattice's lecture a couple of weeks ago, heard something about the Washburn Observatory. But this shows you a photograph from the late 1800s. As Jim mentioned, the observatory was built in 1878 after our state legislature passed an act that set aside, quote, the sum of $3,000 annually for astronomical work and for instruction in astronomy. Doesn't sound like much, but in 1876, $3,000 equaled 1/7 of the university's state-provided budget. Here you see another view, probably a little later, I'm thinking, than the first one, but it shows Washburn on the left, and then on the right, a little building which was the student observatory. The observatory has its original refractor telescope, which at the time the building was built was the largest in the world. And one thing I love about the interior of the observatory dome is it's much like it was when it was built. I really feel a sense of history when I go into that space. You get a strong sense of the people who have worked there and spent time there. That little student observatory was used for instruction so that the main observatory could be used for research. And I think that Jim mentioned that sometimes graduate students were also housed in there, or something to that extent. The solar observatory. Well, that's better than this little building. I was imagining this one. But Washburn Observatory site overlooking Lake Mendota is a beautiful, beautiful site, and it has been a place for observation and celebration of the natural world for far longer time than the observatory has been located there. Here on this image, where you're looking down to the west of the observatory, you see 2 of the Native American effigy mounds that are on the site. One of them, as you can see, is a bird mound. During the last few years, the importance of the mounds and the site to Wisconsin's indigenous people has been emphasized. There's much better signage than there was at the time I did the show, and last year one of Truman Lowe's sculptures of a bird was added to this site, which is a really wonderful thing. The exhibition looked at how people observe the natural world from different perspectives. from the perspective of a trained scientist, but also from the perspective of an amateur scientist as well as an artist. On the left, you see an example of space that professional astronomers would have used. This is the interior of Lick Observatory in California, built about the same time as Washburn. But on the right is a photograph that I really love of a telescope set up in the backyard of the Reverend E.L. Eaton, a Madisonian who was a serious amateur astronomer. I'm interested in the second half of the 19th century, when scientific research was seen as a valuable pursuit for amateurs who often made real contributions to science. Another main source of my visual inspiration is the history of astronomy and cosmology, particularly astronomical instruments and celestial cartography or mapping. This interest started many years ago with a trip to the Greenwich Observatory outside of London, where the museum there had a wonderful collection of historical instruments on view, which I fell in love with. And then a year or two later, I took a course in the history of astronomy with Jim Lattice and found out that we both are interested in how these instruments were made and used. So the following series of slides of scientific instruments, illustrations, and maps of the heavens were source material for pieces in the exhibition and for the idea of putting artworks into an observatory setting. Here's a direct example of that. These are two views of scientific instruments that are housed in the Meridian Room of the Museo della Specula in Bologna, Italy. So these are instruments in what was a working site for astronomical research. This slide shows both sides of an astrolabe from Islamic Spain, made in 1309. An astrolabe is a two-dimensional model in which the celestial sphere with a selection of stars is projected onto the terrestrial horizon zenith coordinate system for a particular latitude. Do I have that right, Jim? That's about right. I would love to make one of these sometime during the rest of my life. It would be a complex project. But simply, these were used to find the time of day or night. Here are two sundials from the collection of the Museum of the Story of Science in Florence. The sundial on the left has multiple dial faces and was made in 1587. The one on the right is a universal sundial from the 17th century. Why am I so interested in these instruments? Well, part of my love for them is because they're truly beautiful objects. Their fine workmanship and materials shows how highly they were valued when they were made, and certainly they continue to be valued today. Another reason that I'm interested in them, though, is because of their function. They combine beauty with function in such a satisfying way. I'd like to make one of these, too. Here you see the grand orrery and a detail of a second orrery on the right, both made by the English instrument maker Thomas Wright around 1733. An orrery is a machine that demonstrates the movements of the sun, the planets, and their moons in our solar system according to the Copernican heliocentric or sun-centered model of the universe. Both of these orreries are in the King George III collection at the Science Museum of Oxford, and I was able to see these a number of years ago, and they are really spectacular. As I worked on this exhibition, I looked at books in the Memorial Library's special collections. In the Woodman Astronomy Library, which I think no longer exists, although I'm not sure of that. No. Oh, it does. Okay. Co-opted into physics. Okay. And I also looked at the Wisconsin Historical Library, looking for examples of celestial maps that I might use in developing the pieces. This slide and the next two slides show maps from a book titled An Astronomy Atlas, which would have been published for enlightened amateurs, people interested in looking at the sky. It was published in 1859 and contains 25 hand-colored celestial charts. Here you see the northern celestial hemisphere from the same atlas, with the detail of the constellations Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and the Lynx. And here you see the southern hemisphere, with the detail of two of the southern constellations in the form of birds, Pavo the peacock and Apus the bird of paradise. So I was looking for a northern and southern celestial hemisphere, in particular to make one of the pieces. Memorial Library's Special Collections has one of the masterpieces of celestial cartography, John Flamsteed's Atlas Celestis, published in 1729. Flamsteed was named the first Astronomer Royal of England in 1675, the year the Greenwich Observatory was founded. Atlas Celestis contains 26 charts of stars visible at that time period from Greenwich, along with 2 planispheres. This is the chart showing the section of the sky with the constellation Pegasus. And here is Ursa Major, a really funny-looking, wonderful Great Bear. But if you have a chance and are interested in seeing this book, you can make a date to go to Special Collections and look at it. Robin's she's nodding her head, this is good. But it's an incredibly wonderful book, and the fact that a copy of this exists on campus, I think, is a really special thing. It's also a very big book. It's very impressive. And as Bob mentioned, another visual source for the pieces in Starry Transit is the history of museums, especially cabinets of curiosity from the 17th and 18th centuries. And then as those cabinet collections morphed into more scholarly natural history museums, I'm interested in that whole transition period. In one way, I thought of the Washburn Observatory as a cabinet that I would fill with a collection of things. This slide shows one of my favorite cabinets, which is in Halle, Germany, and I will really mangle this pronunciation. It's called the Kunst- und Naturalienkammer. This cabinet is perhaps the most complete survival of a cabinet of curiosities. It was begun in 1598 and was enlarged in the 17th and 18th centuries and had a teaching purpose, and it has recently been restored. I wanted you, though, to note the 2 large examples of orreries that are on the floor in the right half of the photo. The one that you see a better view of is as large as a person. It would be really fun to see it. I was also, of course, thinking about birds for this show, and here are 2 views of 19th century taxidermy bird mounts from natural history museums. On the left is a case of birds from the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, and on the right are 2 swans from Booth's Bird Museum in Brighton. Another tongue twister. So this is Brighton, England. I've used the idea of a natural history museum cabinet or cabinet of curiosities in several pieces that I've constructed in recent years. In this piece called My Arcadia, I combined assemblages of found and constructed objects, photographs, and text, trying to show viewers how I work, how I use visual and written sources to explore themes of life, death, and rebirth. This cabinet is in the Chazins collection and is currently on view. And one thing that's really nice about it for people is that unlike most museum pieces, in an art museum certainly, you can interact with this. You can open the drawers and you can look and see what's inside, and then look up in the top of it and compare those 3 trees and the domes in the top and think, what in the world was she thinking about? Go back to the drawers. And here are 2 more drawer interiors from the same cabinet. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen this piece, to go down to the Chazin and take a look at it. The last, but probably most important, very important inspiration for the show, Starry Transit, were studies done by an animal behaviorist named Stephen Imlin. He was working at Cornell in the 1960s. Imlin was studying navigation by night migrating birds, trying to discover whether birds who migrate at night use patterns of stars as wayfinding devices, as aids to navigation. So Imlin, being a guy who wanted to quantify information, designed a special cage. You see two views of it in this slide. On the left is a cross-section of the cage. It's a conical cage with a ring of marking paper that goes around the top of it, and then in the bottom, an ink pad, which the bird sits on, hopefully non-toxic ink. But when the bird tries to fly out of the cage, it marks the paper with its beak or its inky feet, showing what direction it's attempting to fly. Imlin put indigo buntings that were ready to migrate into these cages and placed them in a planetarium at Cornell. The planetarium skies were then rotated arbitrarily so that the stars in the planetarium did not correspond necessarily to the stars outside in the sky. What he found was when the birds tried to fly out of the cages towards the planetarium sky, they flew towards the patterns of stars that would have been in the right direction to migrate, even though they were in the wrong direction in the planetarium, showing that night migrating birds do in some way use patterns in navigation. We've found, there are so many studies that have been done since Imlin's studies. I've been trying to read about them, but now it seems like the aids to navigation are much more complex than we even thought back in the 1960s and 70s. Birds apparently they can orient themselves to the magnetic directions. What's the word I'm looking for? Field, thank you. The Earth's magnetic fields. They can orient themselves to that. They also use some quantum physics kind of stuff to help them migrate, and some birds use different ways of doing it than other species. So it's an ongoing, amazing development, I think, as natural phenomenon. At any rate, when I first saw these studies, I was just amazed and thought, this is something I really want to use to try to develop some artworks. So I started out by making a sculpture called Spring that combines constellation models, etched metal sheets that reproduce the drawings of the Imlin cages, and patterns of beak marks, star maps, and etched pages of writings from an early 20th century journal of bird observations. So that kind of launched me into this. Now I'm going to look at the pieces that were in the exhibition, and a couple of them you can still view in Madison, too. So here you see a view of the interior of the Washburn Dome, a section of it in the daylight, and the piece that is in the foreground is called Starry Transit and was the genesis for all the other pieces in the show. The top of the cabinet is an old store display case that I restored and filled with a landscape tableau containing constellation models and desiccated starlings. The cabinet drawers have etched maps of the spring and fall sky on the left and right, taken from a book called A Celestial Atlas. And this was in Great Britain and was written by James Middleton and published in 1865, so again around the time of the observatory's construction. And the center drawer has real maps of the Western Hemisphere from an 1870 school atlas with the major bird migration marks or routes marked out with pins and string. I wanted to use maps that were from the same time when Washburn Observatory was built throughout the show, and really was able to find a good number of them to use. So this piece is on view in Imaginary Eye upstairs. So some of you may have seen it. If you haven't, after seeing it in a slide, you should really go up and take a look at the drawers. The next few slides are construction photographs for this piece. People always ask me how I make these really complex pieces. In general, I combine found materials and found objects and materials with what I call fabrication, or things that I build by myself. I deliberately blur the line between what is found and what is constructed by me, and even if I'm using found objects and materials, I usually rework them into whatever fabrication I'm doing. So here you're seeing two views of my studio workbench, one of my workbenches filled with stuff. On the left, you see one of the constellation models, or layout of the principal stars in the constellation that I used to build a model, with some clock gears and other things. And on the right, you see one of the constellation models in progress. Next slide, further along, I had decided I wanted to build something that looked like a old fairground riser. And so that's the structure that the constellation models sit on. So I built that myself and put it onto a big base. And here you see on the left, the constellation model sitting on it. I'm in process of starting to fill in the landscape below. And I used spindles that were old salvage spindles from Salvage One, an amazing and wonderful place in Chicago, which no longer exists. But I didn't have enough of those spindles, so I needed to turn some. So I screwed up my courage and did some lathe turning to make the rest of them. And then finally, here you see the getting into the final stages of construction. I was painting the base outside next to the woodpile, and my friend Dietmar Olsch, who is a cabinet maker, built the cabinet base, and we did the finishing and stuff at his shop. So here's Dietmar. So once the cabinet was finished, it needed to be photographed, and I took it to my friend Eric Ferguson's studio, which is in Spring Green. It is now a restaurant called the White School, and some of you may have been there, but it is a really, really beautiful place to have photographs taken. And interestingly enough, this White School building, which was an elementary school, was built in the 1870s, and the architect who designed it was the same man that did Washburn Observatory. So when you go inside it, the detailing, the molding and stuff looks so much like Washburn. So Eric decided he was going to try to do some photographs of this piece at night. And he was trying to simulate what this piece might look like in a dark observatory, because we knew the show would be open after dark, as well as in the daylight. And these photographs remain some of my favorite photographs of my work. But going back to all that verbiage you got to listen to about astronomical instruments that I was talking about before, I decided I wanted to make two machines for the exhibition. One that would be an instrument used in stargazing, and the other that would look at how birds fly. The piece that you see here is called a phenakistoscope. When the viewer turns the disc and looks in a mirror, he or she will see still images of whatever is depicted on the front side of the disc as continuous motion. So in this case, you're seeing the stages of one wing flap of a turkey buzzard. These were photographs taken by Edward Muybridge, and it's superimposed against stars in the sky, section of the Milky Way, and also a comet that goes from the inside of the disk to the outside of the disk when you turn it. The phenakistoscope was one variant on several 19th century parlor toys that used the idea of persistence of vision to simulate motion from still images. These toys, as you can imagine, were a primary source for the development of early motion pictures. This phenakistoscope you see here was patented in 1832. And here are a whole group of discs from those early phenakistoscopes. Some of them are kind of naughty, and some are a lot like Edward Muybridge, Animals in Motion. There were lots of other kinds of persistence of vision toys. Again, I would really like to make more of these. On the left is a zoetrope, which more people are familiar with than a phenakistoscope. And on the right is something called a praxinoscope. Naming was a big deal with these pieces. With both toys, because these were parlor toys, the viewer spins the drum and looks at the center to see the simulated motion. As I mentioned a minute ago, for my phenakistoscope, I used photographs of a turkey vulture in flight, taken in the 1870s, that magic decade, by Edward Muybridge and published in his book, Animals in Motion. Muybridge developed a gun camera that was able to take enough exposures per second to stop some types of motion. He published photographs of moving animals, most famously a galloping horse, and of people performing motions such as running and walking upstairs. So I was familiar with Muybridge, but then became familiar with another man who I'm fascinated with. He's a French physiologist named Etienne Jules Marais. He was working in Paris at the same time that Muybridge was working in California. Marais also developed a stop-action camera and published many photographs of his motion studies, which look, as you can see, pretty different from Muybridge. His motion studies. His work had a great influence on artists such as Marcel Duchamp and Umberto Boccioni, and to me really are eerily prescient of green screen technology. I love these photographs. And as a physiologist, Marais also was gifted at developing machines that measured forces used in muscle movements and the flow of fluids in the body. He developed the first blood pressure cuff and did studies with birds that measured the dynamics of flight. So what kind of force you needed for a bird to move its wings, for example. That's what he was trying to calibrate. I'm really fascinated by how scientists like Marais develop ways to measure and quantify things. But I'm also really drawn to these odd images. Here you see a bird flying. He's hooked up, he's got measuring devices on his torso, and he's sending signals down to a graphing machine down below. Marais also built this pretty wonderful mechanical bird, just something I love. I had to show you that. So back to the sphenokistoscope for a second. This is really a simple machine compared to anything that Marais would have done. But again, the turkey buzzard photographs have been superimposed against a segment of the night sky with the Milky Way running across it. And on the front of the disk, what you see when you're standing facing this machine with the mirror behind you is a time-lapse photograph of stars around the North Pole Star. To me, this was a pun of sorts. The photograph is already spinning, even though the disk is still, and of course, we are on a world that is spinning. Here's a night view of the machine. I still have this piece. I've never shown it again, but at some point I would like to do a show that has several of these kinds of machines. And this is one viewers could operate too. So people had great fun with this. It's pretty sturdy. The other machine I did for the exhibition was a planisphere, an astronomical instrument that shows for a particular latitude, a day of the year, an hour of the day, which stars are visible in the sky. You can get portable versions of these on the internet that you can use to go outside at night and you know what latitude you're at, and you'll be able to rotate them so you can figure out what stars you're seeing in a particular portion of the sky or what stars you should be seeing. My planisphere was made for our latitude, 42 degrees north latitude, but it has a northern and southern hemisphere in it, so it's 42 degrees north and south latitude, respectively. The planisphere works by turning the paper map disk with the colored month and hour rings that are superimposed around the perimeter. So you turn that paper map disk to line up a day of the year with an hour of the day is what's etched on the brass rings. So what you're doing is you got to know what month and day you have, and then also your hour. And then when they have all that aligned and figured out, the viewer looks at the visible section of the sky, which should be in the oval part, that oval brass ring. You look through that, and then you'll see what stars should be visible in the sky. I think I had a better grip on this instrument when I made it than I do right now, to be honest. But really, this piece is a demonstration instrument. It's like those big orreries I showed you before. To be useful, the planisphere should be portable so that you could take it outside and use it. This thing we could have rolled out onto the balcony, maybe around the observatory. I was so sick of it by that time because it was so hard to build. I probably would have pushed it over the balcony, but I forgave it. When someone bought it, I forgave everything. Anyway, I'm digressing. So when I was designing this piece, I worked with Jim Lattice, who was really a taskmaster, as I recall. I looked at lots and lots of celestial maps. I was trying to find a pair from the time period of the observatory that showed enough of the sky to work for the planisphere. And of course, I needed a northern and a southern planisphere. So what you're seeing here is one of the planisphere maps from Flamsteed's Atlas Celestis. That wasn't going to work, and I can't remember why. But anyway, I kept bringing maps to Jim, and he'd say, nah. And finally, we settled on this pair of celestial hemisphere maps from Black's General Atlas of the World in the Wisconsin Historical Society's Rare Books collection, published in 1856. So bingo, it was the right time period, the right kinds of maps. And then Jim took the scans of the circular part of these hemispheres, and he added the rings that you see here, which have the month and hour rings that go around the perimeter of my two maps. And then I had to go home and make all of these etched brass pieces, which were a lot of work, but they eventually got done and connected together and set up behind the brass hour rings and viewing horizons. I really wanted this planisphere to be beautiful and functional, like those old astronomical instruments. This was a much more complicated machine to fabricate, involving lots of pattern making, foundry pattern making, which I know how to do, foundry casting, and general head scratching to get the right kinds of old gears to mesh properly. At that point, I thought, I'm really over my head, and I worked with Tom Pankratz, who ran the Madison Brass Foundry on the east side that's now the Goodman Community Center. And I've spent a lot of time in that place. So he helped me to find the right kind of gears, the right sizes of gears, and he knew more about how to put them together to make them work as a gear set. So I got gears from old mechanical mops, a planetary gear from a car, which we both agreed was really appropriate to use a planetary gear, and then a gear set from a mower sharpener. And by golly, the whole thing actually worked. Here you see a view of the back with the mop gears and so on. I thought that this really fit well into the Washburn Observatory space when it was all done, both in terms of function and aesthetics. I wanted the gears in the piece to refer to the gears in the telescope, because you saw the telescope right in the middle, of course, of the space with its gears, and also the large gear that turns the whole observatory dome. So it was really, I think, a nice conflation of all that stuff. And people coming in couldn't work this thing because I was afraid it would get trashed, but whoever was the gallery attendant could work it for people. And it was really fun to watch people because it made a lot of noise when you turned it. As I said at the beginning of the talk, I wanted the exhibition to look at how people observe the natural world in different ways, using different senses and coming from different perspectives. The 5-panel wall piece that was in the show, called Natural Philosophies, blends different types of observation. It combines images and text from several sources, all of them, I think, in special collections at Memorial Library. Oh, except for this. This was from the Astronomical Library. So you see the background is a star chart. Here's one of the panels on the right inset without all the stuff on top of it. But that shows one star chart from an atlas published in Berlin in 1859. And at this point, the star atlases, at least those that were the result of serious research, tended not to show the pretty constellation figures with hand coloring in them. They tended to show the actual position of stars in the sky and some information about those stars. But I thought they were really beautiful maps. One of my greatest sources of satisfaction as I worked on this project was doing research for images and text for the piece. I wanted to show you just a few of the image sources quickly in hopes that some of you may be inspired to look at them too. I'm always trying to drum up customers for Robin. Besides star maps and charts, I looked at many 19th century popular books on astronomy, usually profusely illustrated with diagrams of planetary movements astronomical instruments, and celestial phenomena like sunspots and comets. Although these were written for an enlightened, amateur, interested audience, they did not dumb anything down. I think these are the most wonderful books. Here you see sections of etched plates from an elementary treatise on physical astronomy by Jean-Baptiste Biot, and I used quite a few images from this particular book in this piece. And of course, I had to have some images of bird physiology. And I looked at comparative anatomy books that had images of bird skeletons, such as these. The 5 panels in natural philosophies have text from 3 sources. And I want to mention at this point that this piece is at the Memorial Library. So if you're interested in it, you can go take a look at it. And it's quite a large piece. It's very detailed, but it's on the 2nd floor of the library, right at the entrance to the reference room. So you go up the grand staircase, it's right there on your right. But at any rate, the text for this piece. One of the sources was a list of the right ascension and declination of the principal fixed stars in the major northern constellations, so how you would see these stars rise and set. This comes from a book written in 1725 by Thomas Wright, an English instrument maker who made 2 of the orreries that I showed you much earlier in the lecture. This list of stars, which you see in the band, which is the sort of pinkish and beige band flowing through this, the list was intended to help people use a celestial globe. I loved it because it reads like poetry. Hydra's heart, the lion's heart, Regulus, in the great bear, in the great bear, the tail of the lion, in the thigh of the bear, the virgin's wing, the virgin's spike. This list of rising and setting stars continues in a meandering band across all 5 panels, referring to the Milky Way and to an earlier, more poetic way of naming stars in the sky. Another source of text for the panels came from an observation from 1880 that was published in the ornithological journal called the Auk. The phenomenon of night migration was really mysterious, especially before night bird flights could be tracked by radar. People could hear birds flying overhead at night, but they couldn't see them. Bird night migration could, however, be observed in a few different ways in the mid-19th century. Birds flew into large lights at night, such as those on lighthouses and outdoor clocks lit at night. This was like flying into a windmill. It killed the birds, so observers counted the numbers and types of birds killed by flying into these lights and used these bird counts to study migration. One article that I found described a large bird migration at night that was illuminated by a forest fire. As the birds flew through the sky, lit by the fire, the observer who wrote the journal article tried to estimate their numbers and species. He also described birds catching on fire and falling into the flames. Another way, however, to observe night migration, which became important, was through a telescope, as birds passed across a lit surface, such as the moon. The second observation in natural philosophies, which you see here, is an equation. And it is by an astronomer who does just that. He's looking at birds against the moon, or he's looking at the moon and sees birds flying in front. And he manages then to develop an equation to try to figure out how high the birds are flying. Off the ground, that is. He determines that the birds are flying 1 to 2 miles above the Earth's surface, which was an astounding idea to contemporary observers. This observation, which contains both astronomy and night migration, which was done in 1880, was a perfect fit for the installation. It was truly serendipity that I dug it out of all those issues of the Auk I was reading. And then the third voice in natural philosophy's panels is that of Mary Mercier, a Wisconsin poet who is also a lover of birds. She responds to bird migration and navigation from both a scientific and a personal perspective. comparing the journeys of birds to the personal journeys that we all make. This is a stanza from her poem, Snow Geese, in the blue ink. One other way to observe night migration is through the flight calls and other flight sounds of night migrating birds. I remember one night in the observatory, Tim Mormond, who is an ornithologist, came to give a lecture, and it was in October, and it was a cold night. Sherry's nodding her head. And he said, you know, this is the kind of night, we had a cold snap, the birds should be flying. And so, Jim, maybe you were there anyway, we opened the slit in the observatory dome, and you could hear the birds flying overhead, over Lake Mendota, which still gives me goosebumps thinking about that. John Fife, a Madison sound recordist, blended recordings of night migrating birds with other night sounds to create an evocative sound piece for the installation. So when you walked into the observatory, you heard this ambient sound, reminding viewers of the outside world surrounding the observatory dome. The last artwork in the exhibition was called Song of the Stars. It contains the words to a Passamaquoddy Indian song surrounded by a wreath of bones from a Canada goose. For me, this piece is a reminder that we are interconnected with all the elements of the natural world, and that we too are part of the cycle of birth, fluorescence, death, and rebirth. It also reminds us of the effigy mounds on the hill next to the observatory. I'm going to close this part of the talk with the words to Song of the Stars. For we are the stars, for we sing with our light, for we are birds made of fire. For we spread our wings over the sky, our light is a voice. We cut a road for the soul for its journey through death. This is the Song of the Stars. And I just have 2 more slides, because Starry Transit seems to be living on. Not only do we have a piece upstairs, but in 2009, Tandem Press published an edition of the Natural Philosophies prints. I was very excited about this when Paula Penchenko approached me and said, would you be interested in trying to do this? And they were starting a new digital printing part of the press. This is kind of a new thing for really high-end G-clay prints at that point, and this was going to be their first digital edition. So I didn't know a whole lot about Photoshop at that period, but I was working with Jason Rule there, and he got the big prints, which is, you may remember, the palette in those prints is like a beige and light brown and black. And he inverted the images in Photoshop. And this is the color palette that came out. I was like, what? He called me on the phone and he said, you gotta come see this, because this has just turned this into a night sky. And I thought about it. I wasn't sure I wanted to change the palette, but then after a while thought, yeah, I'm really liking this. And it also differentiates it from the other piece, the 5-panel piece, which are shadow boxes, they're dimensional as well as prints. So this is what they did for the edition. And you can see this in a couple places on campus. The place I'm most happy that it's located is in the conference room up in Washburn Observatory, which is definitely its spiritual home. And then lastly, people every once in a while are interested in the idea of recreating the show. Oh, fine, no problem, no work, But Jim and I got both our arms twisted in 2011. I think this was the first Wisconsin Science Festival organized by the Wisconsin Institutes of Discovery. It's my memory. And they approached Jim and approached me and said, how about setting that up again for the observatory? And it's a real art-science collaboration. We can have people, go up there during the 2-day weekend. And Jim and I said, okay. And it was a ton of work. Here you see the observatory. These are the Tandem Press prints, so you have a guy looking at it. But it was fun. We had 2 days. A lot of people came through. Sherry and Jim and I talked about the original show together for an event. And here you see the observatory with people flowing around. So that ends my talk. Thanks for being so attentive. I know it's a lot of information to go through, but do we have time for questions? If anybody has any.
Yes, we do have time for a few questions. Raise your hand. I will run the mic around. As always, remember to keep anecdotes short, but questions in depth. And I think we all know what that means.
Say, Martha, one thing you didn't mention was that you went to some trouble to make sure that we could continue to use the observatory normally. So we were doing public nights and things like that. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on any compromises that you had to make, perhaps to allow us to continue to use the observatory in the middle of an art exhibition.
And as Jim likes to point out, this is so far the only art exhibition, to his knowledge, that's been installed in an observatory dome. In a working observatory dome. Harvard has something, but it's pales in comparison, and it's no longer working. Yeah, I think I didn't really realize the the fact that when people come in to do public viewing, or if a graduate student or somebody wanted to work in the observatory, you had to turn the dome around. And turning the dome around meant that there was a large weight on a cord or it's not a weight, it was like the control box, but it was a weight that goes around and around and around and kind of swings. And also the dome was really dirty up there because you use graphite, right, to lubricate the dome. And so the MMoCA staff, they didn't have so much to do at that point because there was this off-site show, but there weren't many shows happening. So they said, well, we'll come and help clean the observatory dome. So I remember we went up there bought a whole bunch of buckets and ladders and stuff, but we were trying to get that ledge where the dome was with all the graphite, so it wouldn't crack graphite off when the dome went around onto the artwork. And the first night the show was operating when the curator was up there, and she was a new curator, and Jane Simon came up with her name. She called me and she was absolutely freaking out. She said, Martha, the glass is going to get broken on the Starry Transit cabinet. But anyway, it was all fine. It was all fine. Nothing happened. But yeah, that was kind of, it was hard, but it worked.
Can you just say how long it took you from the time that you had the concept to the full execution of the artwork?
So the question is, how long did it take from concept to installation? I would say 2.5 years probably. Yeah, so that sounds about right. And I had the idea for the show. I mean, I knew I had bought this big, really beautiful but kind of clapped out display case, this store display case. And I wanted to put constellation models with birds in it. I mean, I knew I wanted to do this because I made that spring piece that I showed you before about bird migration. So I had an idea. I wanted to work up a whole show, and it would be great to do it somewhere like an observatory somewhere. And Steve Fleischman came out and did a studio visit. I've been thinking a lot about this when he was really ill, and he saw that we went out to the local tavern for lunch after the studio visit, and we went out through my garage, and here was this big case sitting on the floor, and he looked at this, he said, what the heck are you going to do with that? And I said, well, I have this idea. I want to do something in an observatory, and da-da-da. And he said, that's a really good idea. You should work up a concept, because we're looking for off-site shows. And so we did. But yeah, so that was probably 2.5 years before.
Yeah, where have all the pieces that were in the observatory been dispersed to now? Thanks.
Well, 2 of them, one is upstairs in the show right now, and the planisphere I sold to a private buyer. Natural Philosophies is on campus, so that was in Memorial Library. I have the phenakistoscope and I have Song of the Stars, but that's what I have left from it. There weren't that many pieces in it. You know, it was large pieces and a small number of them. Yeah. Anybody else?
Martha, I'm not going to remember the name, but the piece that you wanted to roll out the window, there were two like portals on it, like a left and a right.
Yes.
What was on the left versus what was on the right?
So one was the celestial hemisphere map of the sky, celestial map of the southern hemisphere at 42 degrees south latitude, and one was our hemisphere celestial view of the sky, flattened, of course.
Okay.
Yeah,
So one was north and one was south.
right.
And in the last piece that you had inverted in Photoshop, you had like a perfect Palmer typeface.
Oh, yes, that was the poet's
Yeah.
poem. Yeah, good for you for noticing that. Yeah.
For everybody.
As I had an idea. I really wanted to use like a handwritten script that would have been, probably that's a little too late for the observatory time. I'm not sure when the Palmer script really started to happen, but I wanted a beautiful handwritten script that looked like it could have been copperplate almost. And I found a woman who would do calligraphy, and she could do the Palmer script. So she took the poem and she, wrote it as the Palmer script so that we could scan it. Yeah, it was very cool.
That's great.
It's beautiful. Oh, what good questions.
All right, well, thank you very
Okay,
much.
thank you.
Martha.
Yeah.